much welcome to the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, Erkki Tuomioja, who needs no introduction to a Swedish audience, and I are very pleased on behalf of Historians Without Borders and the Institute to welcome you all here. In this world of communication, please do use UI event and for Historians Without Border hashtag politics and history to communicate. Well, actually it's not because we perhaps feel the tough winds of history more acutely today than a while ago that we're actually organizing this event, because Erkki, you started quite a while ago. But surely the intensity of the change that is happening now in the world should make us focus our attention and analysis. The language of Trump must be put at the center, I think, of some of our reflections because of the way not only the transatlantic security order, but perhaps even the constitutional foundations of the democratic order that we have lived is being challenged. Brexit is not only an extremely important choice, fateful one might say, for the UK, but it challenges the European order itself for reasons that are intrinsic to, of course, all of the other EU 27. And for us, it's about stabilizing or disintegrating. And when the Chinese have come to seem the champions of free trade and of a multilateral order respecting climate change, then we know that the geopolitical shifts are fundamental and here to stay. So in our reflection, certainly historical perspectives must be at the core. They become even more relevant, and the images that politicians use are different and have to be understood. And therefore, the theme that Erkki chose when we had the chance to have you here about what politicians must do is the one we chose, the listening and the leading. That's the subject. Erkki, obviously you were foreign minister twice, but after you left office, you took over this line of thinking, what to do with historical reflection to solve conflict, but to guide politicians ahead. We're very pleased to have you here. You have had a meeting with your board today and are thinking ahead, and one of the purposes of having you here is as well to engage Swedish academics and thinkers into a broader network of people who reflect on these issues. With that, Erkki, my co-host, please.
Well, thank you, dear friends, and thank you very much to the Swedish Institute for International Affairs for co-arranging this meeting. We have had very good cooperation on many items, and I'm looking forward to continuing that. The background to the Historians Without Borders initiative was very much in my double capacity and experience, both as a historian and foreign minister, having run countless times into situations and issues and conflicts where history, even very ancient history, continued to play a negative role, and where history was misused and abused by parties to the conflict to keep up these enemy images and make it more difficult for resolving conflicts. So we in Finland started asking ourselves, what could we as historians do to turn this the other way around? How could historians contribute to conflict prevention and conflict resolution and prevent the abuse of history in conflicts? And based on this, we established the Historians Without Borders in Finland in June 2015 as an NGO, but we immediately started working to make this an international network. And we arranged a conference on the use and abuse of history in May last year at the University of Helsinki. And at the end of the conference, we agreed on a declaration establishing the International Network of Historians Without Borders. Since then, we have been starting working on quite a lot of outreach activities, introducing the initiative to interested historians and others. And I would say that overwhelmingly the reception has been very positive. And indeed, there are many expectations, great expectations on us to deliver on the ideas that we have. And we can only hope that we find all the resources necessary to be able to answer to these expectations. And when we are asked who is our audience, I think our audience is obviously historians, but we are part of that audience ourselves. It is politicians who can and are responsible for delivering the concrete results of any work that historians in prevention of conflicts can do. And thirdly, it's the general public also, because I think we are living in increasingly ahistorical times where the understanding and knowledge of how and from where we have arrived at where we are today is diminishing rather than increasing. And with this post-factual period that we are living in, this becomes even more of an issue. So one of the items that we want to discuss here today is the role of politicians in dealing with history. And this was also addressed in the collection of articles, The Use and Abuse of History, which was published for our conference last May, and where I would say the leading article is from Timothy Garton Ash on exactly these questions of how free speech and the study of history should be combined, and what is the role of politics. I think it's easier to say what the role of politicians should not be. We should not engage in history as legislators, legislating about or passing declarations, parliamentary resolutions on how to deal with history and what is so-called historical truth. And I think this is one of the issues we should discuss today, and then ask what should be the positive role of politicians in dealing with history. Originally, we also had a fourth panelist here, but unfortunately, Zem Özdemir from Germany was at the end unable to come to the meeting. And this leaves a gap because Carl Bildt and I are politicians, but I don't think that we are among those who will defend the legislative role of politicians in history. On the contrary, so that is a gap. And if there is someone in the audience who's willing to take that role, you are most welcome to do so. But I think we should now pass the floor on to Timothy Garton Ash for your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in Sweden, despite Donald Trump's terrible warnings about what I might find here. I have to say, I think it was a great tribute to Sweden, because the way he said it, he repeated the word Sweden 3 times with total incredulity, as if even this utopia of peace and civility could be shaken by totally fictitious attacks. Anyway, it is a great pleasure to be here and to speak in the context of this really great initiative of Erkki's, which I tremendously support, and with a historian I hugely admire, Margaret MacMillan. I don't just say that because she's warden of my college in Oxford, and with 2 politicians who've been deeply engaged on these matters. I think what I'm supposed to do is to give you what in New German is called ein Impulsvortrag. So I'm going to concentrate my impulses on 3 questions, amongst, by the way, the many, many questions that we could ask about politics and history and what politicians should do. First question, what politicians and states more generally can do but shouldn't. Secondly, what politicians and states more broadly, indeed figures in public life, can do and maybe should, but there are some interesting issues there, going to Erkki's question about the positive. And then, thirdly, what I think politicians and historians definitely should be aiming more for together in an open society and a liberal democracy. Now, for the first two of those questions, I use what I think is a very powerful distinction by the American political scientist Corey Brettschneider between two roles of the state. He distinguishes between the coercive and the expressive role of the state. And the key sentence is from John Locke on toleration. It is one thing to persuade, another to command. One thing to press with arguments, another with penalties. So, as you may imagine, my answer to the first question, in line with that given by John Locke, is I do not think the state should in any way proscribe or prescribe by law what is or is not true of the past. Historians' claims. In other words, I do not think the coercive function of the state should be involved at all when it comes to the study of history and indeed the dissemination of history. Now, this may seem to many of us here self-evident, but actually many, many European countries now have memory laws which invoke this coercive power to a greater or lesser degree. And I believe all those memory laws are incompatible with free speech, the free study of history, and have many negative effects. Let me say briefly what I think they are and why that is so, because I think there will be a lot of agreement about this. First of all, near the heart of the way historical knowledge progresses, the way in which we approach the truth as closely as we ever can about the past, is by claim and counterclaim, thesis and counter-thesis being advanced, however outrageous and extreme and apparently implausible that claim is, and then being tested against the evidence. So Fritz Fischer says the First World War began as a result of deliberate planning by Germany. Christopher Clark says, no, they were sleepwalkers. All the states of Europe sleepwalked into war. Margaret can speak very knowledgeably and eloquently to this. We test those theses against the available evidence. This is true even in the case of the Holocaust of the European Jews. And the classic example of this is, of course, David Irving. David Irving, who was certainly, in many of his publications, clearly a Holocaust denier, was not himself prosecuted in Britain, because Britain does not have memory laws of this kind. However, as many of you know, an American historian called Deborah Lipstadt wrote an excellent book analyzing his work and documenting why he is a Holocaust denier. He, David Irving, not the state, prosecuted her, went to court against her and Penguin Books for libel, and in a great High Court case, rather romantically represented in the film Denial, I'm sure many historians would love to be represented like that, he lost the case spectacularly, and the judge said he was indeed a Holocaust denier. So to those for whom David Irving was not already discredited, he was now comprehensively discredited. Soon thereafter, he went to Austria, which of course has a law on Holocaust denial, and they arrested him, and they put him in prison for some time. Result, he could represent himself as a martyr for free speech. And he actually went around the world for some time afterwards, gave me great speeches, including at the Oxford Union, about how he was a martyr for free speech. Which method, that of free historical debate or that of memory laws, more effectively discredited David Irving? I rest my case. By the time we get to the Armenian genocide, or those events which some have described as the Armenian genocide, the story becomes almost farcical. So first of all, Bernard Lewis, the very distinguished British-American historian, is convicted by a French court in 1995 for denying in Le Monde that the terrible suffering of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, particularly in 1915, could, in the strict definition in international law, be described as a genocide. If you go on our website, freespeechdebate.com, we give a link to the original verdict. It's well worth reading, along with the article in Le Monde, because he's actually being extremely nuanced. But anyway, so he's found guilty of genocide denial. Then, a few years later, in 2006-07, an extreme Turkish nationalist called Doyu Perinçek is convicted in Switzerland for maintaining that it was not a genocide, for genocide denial. Soon thereafter, the well-known Turkish writer Orhan Pamuk is convicted, or rather prosecuted, he wasn't finally convicted, but prosecuted in Turkey for saying that it was a genocide, something he'd said incidentally in a Swiss newspaper, the Tagesanzeiger. So what is state-ordained and prescribed truth in the Alps is state-ordained falsehood in Anatolia. You can see how ridiculous it becomes with these contradictory forms of legislating the historical truth. Interestingly, the verdict on Perinçek, so the Swiss verdict, was overthrown by the European Court of Human Rights in 2015, a point I'll come back to, and Mr. Perinçek is now in an unholy alliance with President Erdogan of Turkey. I just came back from Turkey this weekend, and I was presented there with a book by the very distinguished Turkish journalist Hasan Cemal called 1915 Armenian Genocide, published in Turkey in both Turkish and English. He hasn't yet been prosecuted. This is particularly piquant because Hasan Cemal, as some of you will know, is actually the grandson of the Cemal Pasha, who was one of those held responsible for the Armenian genocide. But Hasan, in this book, writes very, very eloquently about how the whole debate in Turkey has been frozen, distorted, and poisoned by this focus on the G word. And he describes how he agonizes before giving a lecture somewhere in Western Europe. Should I use the G word or shouldn't I? I think Turkey is a classic example of the damage that is done by criminalizing certain versions of the historical truth. Then there is what I call, in my book on free speech, available in all good Amazons, the taboo ratchet. The German government initiated what became what is called a European Union framework decision against racism and xenophobia, which attempts to generalize the German, specifically German ban. This is documented in the EU documents, by the way, it's not just me asserting it, to generalize the German practice, a practice which is, of course, quite understandable in the context of German history, to all genocides and all EU member states. And so, who then qualifies? If the Nazi Holocaust of the European Jews, why not the Armenian genocide? If the Armenian genocide, why not the Ukrainian famine genocide, the Holodomor, which was an act of political mass murder, and so on. The taboo ratchet goes on and on. Interestingly, in Hungary and Poland, what has happened is they started with the offense of Holocaust denial. They've now moved on, in both Hungary and Poland, also to criminalize denial of the mass murders committed by communist regimes. So it's both Nazi and communist. But then, why do we stop there? Why can't we go further? There are many groups who would wish to claim that they have been subject to a genocide. are we to have a European Commission-approved list of certified genocides? I think not. Moreover, another malign effect of this is that it encourages identity politics in which different groups in our society lobby for recognition from the state, actually for their own political purposes very often, to establish themselves. And I believe you might be familiar in this country with that as elsewhere. So, in short, it is a great pity we don't have Cem Özdemir here to argue the contrary case, because it'd be nice to hear it, but I would argue that we should have no memory laws of this kind. But now I turn to the second question, what politicians can and should do. And here I think that in the expressive, rather than the coercive function of the state, there is a very great deal that politicians can and arguably should do. For example, for me, as someone who's written the history of Ostpolitik, German Ostpolitik, Willy Brandt falling to his knees in front of the monument to the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in Warsaw is one of the great moments of post-war European history. It was an expressive act, a politician saying something about history. Helmut Kohl, to his great credit, was absolutely determined that there should be a Holocaust memorial at the very heart of Berlin before he left office, that the decision should have been made. In the United States, we have a Holocaust museum and now an African American museum on the Mall. Memorial days, medals, speeches, like the great speech made by Richard von Weizsäcker in 1985, the speech made by President Alexander Kwaśniewski of Poland about the Jedwabne horror when the Polish inhabitants of a small town, a village in Poland, murdered that village's Jews. Even the Queen going to Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, for the first time, where she spoke in a rather interesting way, because Her Majesty obviously has to speak very cautiously, but she spoke by coming out of the airplane wearing green, entirely green, the colours of era of the Irish Republic, and this was regarded as a great, great gesture, so far as Queen speaking go, and she also risked a few words of Gaelic. But all these things seem to me entirely legitimate and actually important contributions of politicians to the country's relationships to their difficult paths. Even more substantially, when countries do have a difficult past, I think that the model of the Truth Commission is one which has a great deal to be said for it. In such situations, at the end of an authoritarian regime or a civil war or an occupation, you cannot have individual justice against all the perpetrators. It is simply impossible. But you can have some attempt to get at the truth, both knowledge about the past and, as important, some public acknowledgement of what has happened in the past. And I would further argue that one of the great mistakes made in Central and Eastern Europe after 1989 was precisely not to have truth commissions, not to have any public, symbolic exploration of and then acknowledgement of the difficult past. Because these were velvet revolutions, negotiated revolutions, inevitably a lot of figures from the old regimes were left in place and also left to get rich. And there was a great sense in many parts of society of a missing catharsis. And the effect of doing something like a truth commission or an inquiry commission with that public acknowledgement is to draw a clear line between past and future. And I'll come back to that because I think that's a very important function. And I would argue that some of the revanchist politics that you're now seeing, particularly in Hungary and Poland, particularly from the Law and Justice Party in Poland, is at least in part because there was no symbolic and public confrontation with the past. Now this, of course, goes also to parliamentary resolutions of another kind. I think it's important that the difficult past you're confronting is one of your own country, either domestically or in its relations with other countries. In the European Court of Human Rights verdict overturning the Perinček judgment in Switzerland, it says, I think almost amusingly, about this case in the Armenian genocide, I quote, "It has not been argued that there was a direct link between Switzerland and the events that took place in the Ottoman Empire in 1915. Well, indeed, I think it's a fair bet that the Swiss guards were not marauding around Anatolia in 1915. But actually, nor, I think, were the Swedish armies, great as the feats of Swedish arms have been through history. And therefore, there is at least a question. There is at least a question what the Swedish parliament is doing, passing a resolution about the Armenian genocide, something with which, so far as I'm aware, and maybe Margaret will tell me that I'm wrong, Sweden did not have much to do. So I think there has to be a sense of proportionality in these gestures, and I think otherwise, and I come back to the point, they do become part of identity politics in a multicultural society, with significant lobbies in the society agitating for a parliament or government to take one or the other position. But this is an interesting question, one I think we need, I'd like to hear Carl on this, one I think we need to discuss. The other area which I think is really quite challenging, but where in principle politicians have a legitimate road, is that of setting curricula, particularly school curricula, textbooks, and so on. After all, most governments do that to some extent. They say what should be taught, at least to in some boundaries. And that seems to me, in principle, legitimate. But of course, there is always a danger that a very nationalist government or other nationalist authorities in a power to do so will come along and impose a very partisan, partial, mythopoeic nationalist view of history. So we had the new history textbook in Japan. In Poland now, the Law and Justice government is essentially setting out completely to rewrite the history curriculum and to turn it into a nationalist narrative, a simplistic mythopoeic nationalist narrative. Even in Britain, we had a more modest attempt under the last Conservative government to rewrite the history curriculum in schools, somewhat in the direction of from Alfred the Great to Brexit. Fortunately, some historians and educators pushed back, and I think what's come out has been reasonably okay, but even in pre-Brexit England, there was that attempt. But nonetheless, I think these are things that politicians should, at least in principle, legitimately be engaged in. Let me now turn to my third impulse and talk about something which, a sort of larger question which I think should frame this whole conversation, which is, to the extent that historians and politicians are working together, what is the goal they are trying to achieve for societies and for international society in relation to the past? Now here, of course, the classic text is from Ernest Renan, his great essay on what is a nation, in which he says that a nation is a community of shared memory and shared forgetting. Every French citizen, he says, should have forgotten the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. And rather wonderfully, he goes on to say, and in this respect, therefore, historians are a great danger to a nation, because they remind countries of things they'd rather forget. By the way, there's a more popular version of Renan's definition of a nation, which I rather like, which is that a nation is a community of people brought together by a shared hatred of their neighbors and a common misunderstanding of their own past. which I think is rather good. So, to that extent, historians, proper historians, are a threat to these national myths, and there is, as there is with the press, a necessarily adversarial relationship with governments which are necessarily trying to peddle some sort of a narrative or half-truths. A great example of this, because I think her name should be mentioned in this context, is the wonderful Indian historian Romila Thapar. Maybe one or two of you know her work on ancient Indian civilization. And she has done a magnificent job of standing up to the Indian version of nationalist populism being propagated by the Modi government, which builds on an absolutely simplistic version of Hindu nationalism and the Hindu past. And she, as a great historian, is doing what historians should do and saying it's a whole lot more complicated than that. And that doesn't hold up. In response to which she's been threatened with being charged with sedition and repeatedly called anti-national, which is the great populist label, a badge I think she could wear with pride, and we're seeing the same thing in Russia and in Turkey. But it's not, I believe, just an adversarial relationship. I think there is also a synergy that is to be found. And the question here is, what is the kind of relationship to the difficult questions of the past that we would ideally like to achieve in an open and free society, in a liberal pluralist democracy? And here my argument is that there is there's a Scylla and a Charybdis. There are two extremes that we have to avoid. One is amnesia, the other is what I call hypermnesia. So amnesia is obvious, forgetting. Now actually, that's what Europeans traditionally did for many centuries of European history. Oblivion, in the classical sense, was a prescription. From Cicero, 2 weeks after the murder of Julius Caesar, he said these things should be oblivionis sempiterna delendam, all the way through to the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion, which ended the English Civil War, quite a few European peace treaties in the 19th century, and even to 1945, when Churchill initially went in that direction. So it's actually rather a recent development in European history that we look not for forgetting and oblivion, but for remembering since 1945. But there are exceptions to that rule, and the most striking one is Spain after Franco. Spain after Franco deliberately tried what Jorge Semprún called amnesty and amnesia. It was quite a deliberate strategy, which my Polish friends after 1989 were consciously emulating. They were saying, if you're going to do a transition from democracy through a negotiated revolution, that's what you do. You try and forget about it. Well, I would submit it certainly hasn't worked in Poland, where issues about the past have come back to haunt Polish politics, but it didn't even work in Spain, because in the end, it's come back to haunt Spanish politics. The other extreme is this condition which I call hypermnesia, which is characterized in some very unfortunate individuals by a total inability to forget, a total recall, which is, of course, a nightmare. An example of where this gets you comes from my own experience in Serbia and Kosovo in the 1990s, and I'm sure Carl has had similar experiences. I remember once talking to the then Serbian governor of Kosovo. Sorry, am I too loud or too... My then Serbian governor of Kosovo, when Kosovo was still under Serbian rule. And I thought it would be useful to start the conversation by clarifying the ethnic breakdown of Kosovo, where, of course, the Albanians were the overwhelming majority of the population. And so I asked him, could you just tell me before we start, what's the ethnic composition of Kosovo? And he replied, in the 12th century, the Serbs were 95% of the population. According to the UN census of 1187, you understand. And that was a wonderful example of the condition of hypamnesia as you see it in Northern Ireland or in much of the Balkans or in Ukraine perhaps today. And what happens is that the necessary and healthy line between past and present is almost completely erased. And it is as if instead of being diachronous, it's synchronous. All history is somehow in simultaneity, so that it doesn't seem odd to a Serbian governor of Kosovo to answer a question about the ethnic composition in 1998 by telling you about 1187. The same was true for many years in Belfast. Some of you may know the old joke that the plane comes into land at Belfast and the pilot says, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming into land. The weather in Belfast is rainy, it's 12 degrees, and the time in Belfast is 1683. It's the same phenomenon. It's captured by Hassan Jamal in his book on the Armenian genocide when he talks about what we really don't want is to be taken hostage by history. And this is a condition of being taken hostage by history. And this is what, in my view, Geschichtsaufarbeitung, a German term I much prefer to Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which I think has problematic connotations, is all about. What truth commissions and good historical research of the recent past and good textbooks, sometimes indeed binational textbooks like the German-Polish textbooks, are all about. They are about trying to bring about, to restore to a society, what I would suggest is a sort of healthy condition of social memory, with all due caveats about how far one can generalize about collective memory at all. And this is what I call not amnesia or hypamnesia, but mesomnesia. Mesomnesia is the middle way, the golden mean, where the facts about the past are known and generally accepted, even if interpretations necessarily differ. There is both knowledge and public acknowledgement, which is very important in these situations, but the past is past. Pace, William Faulkner's famous remark. The past is past. There is a clear line between the past and present. We know what happened in the past, but we're not thinking about it every day. It's not poisoning our present. And that, I think, is one of the areas which is really important, both socially and politically, domestically and international, and is something which I think politicians and historians can really usefully work together to bring about. Those are my three impulses. Of course, there's much more to be said. I'm looking forward very much to the discussion with the other panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Timothy, for those inspiring words of introduction to us. Margaret MacMillan, also professor at Oxford. You wrote very evocatively in that book that is in Timothy's left hand about history and its role in understanding good and evil. History restores a sense that necessarily of a divine being, not necessarily the sense of a divine being, but of something above and beyond human beings. It is our authority. It can vindicate us and judge us and damn those who oppose us. And maybe there's another Scylla and Charybdis within which to find a way. Very much welcome. Please offer us your comments.
I think I'm going to stand up if you'll forgive me. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to our chairman, and thank you very much, Timothy, for that wonderful talk. I don't think actually history does judge us. I think we tend to think that history is this impartial force which one day will judge us. It will measure us, and it will sometimes make us look very foolish, which is probably good for us. But I think history is something that we need to treat with great care. We tend to think, and my students always used to say to me that, you're so lucky to teach history because you only have to do your lecture notes once. And I keep saying history keeps changing because we keep asking different questions and we keep finding out new things. And I think one of the most important things we do as historians is continue to question the past, continue to try and ascertain what are the facts about the past. I think Timothy's absolutely right that part of what we do is try and establish facts. And I think one of the unfortunate consequences, unforeseen, of the whole postmodern turn, the idea that it really didn't matter, there was nothing called objective truth, that really it was who was the position you were speaking from that determined what you were going to say, has been very unfortunate, because it has given a sense that there is nothing that you can grasp hold of in the past. And there are things that are true, and there are things that are false, and I think we keep trying to do that. But I think what historians also do is we keep asking questions. There never used to be something called women's history when I was growing up, and when the position of women changed and there was a feminist movement, we began asking questions about women in the past. And we're now asking questions about ecological history, environmental history, because of our present day concerns, and that's as it should be. I think what historians also have to do is go, there was a wonderful movie called Ghostbusters, which some of you may have seen. Well, we're mythbusters. I think what we do is we go around and we say, no, that is actually not true. We are like those very tedious people at a dinner party when someone is telling a very funny story and then the story is about to reach its climax and everyone is enjoying it, and someone will say at the table, but you can't have been there on a Thursday because remember you weren't in Stockholm that day, or you can't have been on that bus because that bus doesn't run between that town and that town. But that's what we do as historians. We stop the narrative and we say, wait a minute, that simply is not true. And I think we have to keep doing it, unpopular though it may make us, because history can be very dangerous. And I think we've seen what it can do in the hands of politicians and others. History is used to justify treating your neighbors badly, treating them as if they're not human, blaming them for often imagined grievances or slights in the past. History can be used to inspire people. It can portray a golden past and say, we're going to have that golden past again, we're going to have a golden future. When Donald Trump says things like, I'm going to make America great again, that's in fact what he's doing. He's calling on a history which is probably not the full history of the American past, it can't be, and he's portraying a future. That in a sense is what ISIS does, or Daesh does, when it talks about the golden age right after the death of the Prophet, when all Muslims lived in harmony under the rules laid down by the Prophet, and we will get you that golden world again. It's a very, very powerful motivating force, and as we've seen, it's led to great evils and great horrors in our lives. And so I do think historians have to try and challenge those myths, and as I say, it doesn't always make us very popular. What I think we also need to do, and this is, I think, very difficult, is try and impress upon politicians that they need to know history. Because I think we need to ask ourselves what happens when politicians don't know history. And it's also what happens when we as citizens don't know history. When you don't know history, you are depriving yourself of a way of understanding other people and understanding the world in which you live. Now, there are many ways of trying to understand our world. We should try and understand something of its economic structures, its technology, the ways in which different nations link together. We should try and understand something of the culture of others, the anthropology, the social institutions of others. But a large part of that comes from history. We are the products of history. We're the products as individuals and we're the products as groups of our own pasts. We quite often as well inherit pasts from others. We grow up in a world which has particular views. We grow up in a group which has particular views. Sometimes we accept those without question and they shape our worldview. Sometimes we question them, but we are always engaging in some way or other with the past. And I think it's so important, not just for us as citizens, but for our leaders to know something of the past. How can our political leaders deal with some of the problems in our own societies if they don't understand how those problems came about? How can they deal with others? And this is a complicated world. I mean, the world's always been complicated perhaps, but it seems to me we're living at a particular time of uncertainty and turbulence. How can our political leaders deal with others if they don't know something of what those people are remembering? And you live in this country very close to Russia. How can the Baltic countries, how can the rest of Europe, how can the United States, how can my own country, Canada, understand that Russia without knowing what it is that the Russians are remembering of their own history? The invasions they've had, the empire which they have seen shrink. How can we understand Putin himself without knowing something of his own personal history? how he was there in 1989 when the Cold War came to an end, how he was humiliated to see what happened to what had been a superpower as it suddenly became much less important. He once said to a Canadian I knew who was visiting, a Canadian politician, they were talking about something, and Putin said, in a rather casual way, he said, as my predecessor Peter the Great might have said. You need to know that about Putin, I think. It's not that he's constantly referring to the past, but for him, I think the past is an important part of his worldview. And so if politicians, political leaders don't know history, they're not really going to be able to gauge how others are going to behave or react. And they're going to make decisions in a vacuum. I think that we have so many examples of this in recent history. The way in which Russia was treated after the end of the Cold War, the contempt with which many in the United States and the West talked about Russia as a failed state, that they should have known better, because Russia is a great country, it has a great landmass, it has a very long history, and the Russians have a very strong sense of themselves. I think political leaders in the West, notably Tony Blair and President George Bush Jr., should, and their advisors should have asked, what will happen if we send troops into Iraq? This is a country which has an historical record of not liking foreign troops very much. When the British sent troops into Iraq and tried to manage Iraq after the First World War, they almost immediately faced a massive revolt up and down the great valleys of the Euphrates and the Tigris. Very little was done to prepare those troops going into Iraq to understand the history of Iraq. The State Department tried to, the Foreign Office tried to, and they were told, don't bother, we don't need to know the past. We are so powerful, we will create new facts on the ground. We will create the future. And it's telling, and in fact rather sad, that when some of the officers in Iraq, both British and American, found what they were dealing with, they sent back, probably to Amazon, for copies of T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom. Now, how much that would have helped them is a moot point. I could have suggested books that might have been more useful, but you would see what they were trying to do. They were trying to find out something about the people with whom they were dealing. I think history among political leaders can help inform their view of the world, help warn them that if they take certain actions, it will turn out badly. And I think history is also important because it helps us understand ourselves better. We tell ourselves very pleasing stories about ourselves, and those stories aren't always true. And I think if you're going to deal with others, you need to know how they might see you. The United States, I'm Canadian, we live next door to the United States, and Americans tell themselves a story of a power that has always been anti-colonial, that has never tried to push its neighbors around, which has never tried to take its neighbors' territory. Well, you tell that to Mexico, and you tell it to Canada, and we see it differently, because we have had the United States, in the case of Mexico, taking huge amounts of territory. In Canada, they tried, and in a great moment in Canadian history, which the rest of the world doesn't know about, we sent them packing. But we also tell ourselves stories about how nice we are. In Canada, we tell ourselves a story that we've always been a peace-loving and gentle and tolerant people. Now, some of you here in Sweden may have gone to see a hockey game where a Canadian team has been playing. Okay, you know what I mean. We're not always so peace-loving and gentle and kind. And so I do think having history, having some sense of the past is not just a luxury, not just something that helps our political leaders. I think it's absolutely essential that they have a sense of the past. It will help them to understand others, to understand themselves, but it will also help them to formulate questions. What if? What if we do such and such? What is likely to happen? What might happen? What is likely to happen now between the United States and China? Is it inevitable that a rising power will go to war with a declining power? Is that how history works? Or are there other examples that we can look at? And I think, again, very, very important that we should be able to formulate questions. And I suppose the final thing, and there are many things that history can do, but perhaps the final thing that history can do for our political leaders is give them a sense of humility. They may be very powerful, very important, but there have been other very powerful and very important people in the past who have made really stupid mistakes. And I think history can give you a sense of humility, which is actually very important. Thanks.
Wonderful. First order of the day, don't make more mistakes. Carl Bildt, very much welcome to us.
Thanks very much, Mats. I think this is going to be a fairly boring afternoon for the simple reason that I think we we will fail to raise any major disputes between us, because I think our approach to these issues are fairly similar. I think history is among the most dangerous things that politicians are dealing with, because history is to a large extent also the demons of the past, and the demons of the past can be extremely dangerous when you bring it out in the present. Margaret mentioned what is happening these very days, when we have the return of identity politics, and you have this slogan that you find all over the place, make Islam great again, or make Russia great again, or make America great again, or, well, we haven't had the German version of it yet, but you see that this sort of nostalgic, going back to some greatness that was there, and has implicitly been stolen from us by someone else, is not something that leads necessarily to constructive politics in the present. I think when it comes to politicians in history, two things should be said. Be aware, that is very important, and stay away, that is equally important. Be aware, because history shapes the DNA of nations. We are all the one way or the other. We might not be aware of it, but amazingly we are the product of history, our DNA. And our DNA shapes the way nations, however modern they think they are, how they react also in the present. So if you don't understand the history, you don't understand a substantial part of the present either. The other parts of the world where I think there is a more understanding of these issues than I think there is in, for example, Sweden, where we sometimes think that we are so modern that we can leave history behind us. I would say that applies not only understanding, Margaret mentioned I vividly remember, by the way, prior to the Iraq War, when we had an historian who was telling the 1920s Mesopotamia Rising, which caught the Brits by surprise, and the Brits they dealt with it with two ways: bombing by aircrafts and gas. But awareness of that was totally non-existent at that particular time. But it also applies to more nearby countries. You can't understand Finland if you don't understand now 1917, or if you don't understand the Winter War, or if you don't understand 1944, you can forget about talking even with the modern Finn if you don't know something about this. You can't understand Norway without an awareness of 1905, and primarily the 9th of April 1940, totally impossible. You can go to a bookstore in Oslo and see the number of books that are still published to this day about the different aspects of what happened in 1940. And you can't understand Denmark without understanding 1864. I have to say I was somewhat shocked in the summer. We were at a conference together with a fairly substantial part of what self-described Swedish elite, I think can be said, say 200 persons. And I asked them how many were aware of Dybbel 1864, which shaped Denmark. And I think there were 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 at the most who were aware of that. We have an ignorance of history that makes it difficult for us Swedes sometimes to understand even our closest neighbors. And of course, the further away we go, the more we should be aware of the lack of awareness and what it means. But then, accordingly, be aware. That is important. Stay away, equally important. Tim talked quite a lot about whether one should have laws, sort of freedom of speech and things like that, and trying to have those sorts of ways of regulating history. And I think the Swedish tradition is, of course, fairly solid in terms of having extremely wide margins of the freedom of expression. We have some limits, but they don't apply to anything relating to history whatsoever. Neither do I think that they should. But sometimes there has been the tendency, even in Sweden, to take political decisions on history. And the most recent case was alluded to, that the Armenian genocide or not, I was foreign minister at the time, and the then rather strange majority in Parliament, consisting of course, the party of the left and the Social Democrats and the Sweden Democrats, by the way, that was a coalition worthy of the name, they decided that Sweden should have as an official position that it was genocide in 1915. I opposed that. I said, we are not going to have any position whatsoever on this, because this is things for the historians to sort out, or perhaps legal people if they care to. And eventually they brought me to and I said I'm going to ignore it, which I did. They brought me to the Constitutional Committee of the Parliament and tried to create difficulties for me, but I'm happy to note that since there's been a change of government in Sweden, they have quickly forgotten about their previous views, which I think is good, because I think this illustrated the dangers of taking political decision. That tends to polarize. It never brings people together, because it only brings the incentive from the one group or the other to escalate and have new political decisions on new aspects of history. And I might add that particularly in a country like Sweden, where we used to be only or primarily people born here, we are now a country where we have 22% of our population coming from abroad. Sometimes they are coming from areas with a somewhat more complicated history. And if the complicated histories and the conflicts of their origins are brought into the Swedish political system, I think that is not going to be conducive to what we are seeking to build together and form our attitude towards the future. Genocide is a very controversial concept. It is, of course, Nuremberg. It is, of course, the genocide. But then, of course, it has been a label that everyone wants to attach to virtually everything in the modern world. I've been deeply involved in genocide, I was going to say, but in genocide debates, primarily with the Balkan Wars, of course, where every single group is absolutely convinced that genocide have been committed against them by the others. Everyone. I mean, the Bosnian Muslims are convinced that the Serbs committed genocide against them. The Croats think that the Serbs committed genocide against them. The Serbs are convinced that the Croats committed genocide against them. The Albanians are convinced that the Serbs committed genocide against them. And I've probably forgotten a number of the things, but total conviction of these particular things. And what we did do was, of course, here to set up legal mechanisms. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, that was supposed to, or I wouldn't say it was supposed to sort out these things, because it was supposed to set out individual responsibility. The idea was that there should not be collective responsibility. There should be individual responsibility. But then that has sort of escalated into the different nations, states, trying to get the others sued for genocide, also to the International Court of Justice. And that has now become, de facto, something that impedes progress in the Balkans. This very week, the Bosniak or Bosnian Muslim, Bakir Izetbegovic, is saying that they should now bring an appeal to the International Court of Justice on the genocide case that was decided by the International Court of Justice 10 years ago. And evidently, you have to do it within 10 years. Well, that brings out all of the demons of the past, apart from the fact that it breaks Bosnia, because they can't take a decision on it, and that they have a spirited discussion about these particular things. So history, treat it carefully, genocide word, keep it with the courts and the historians, but absolutely out of the political domain. But then, going back to what Tim said, one shouldn't forget, and one shouldn't overdo it. Again, Yugoslavia, I think one of the major things that contributed to what a lot of people from the outside world found surprising, that is how quickly it escalated in the early 90s. From a conflict that was perhaps political to something that was village against village and normal people against normal people. And I think that was one of the results of Tito having suppressed the entire history of what happened during the war. That was so horrendous and so difficult to deal with that Tito found that the only way of dealing it was to not talk about it as a de facto, make all of history for that period virtually illegal. But you can't do that, because the parents were telling their children, and the children were telling their children. And when then the lid was off, there was no sort of established history, or there was no reconciliation. It was only the brutal memories that came back. And then everyone felt under threat and acted as they were under threat. So history, dangerous, be aware, but stay away. Finally, illustrating this just with the 3 anniversaries that we have this year, which are not entirely uncomplicated to deal with. The first one is 500 years since the Reformation. The Reformation is still not an issue that has been sorted out. When the Pope was going to do the first thing that he was going to do during the Reformation year, it was not possible for him to go to Germany. That is still too sensitive, both from the German point of view and from the Vatican point of view. So they ended up in Lund in southern Sweden. He might still, perhaps, touch down on German soil towards the end of the year, but that is subject of negotiations. And we know, of course, that 1517 started a period of turmoil in European history, which had all sorts of effects, including, by the way, the setting up of Sweden. Second anniversary is 1917, which is, of course, 100 years since the independence of Finland, which is going to be celebrated in our neighbor. But not an entirely easy thing to deal with for today's Russia, whether communism is good or whether bad. Was there any possibility for a democratic evolution of Russia? Was Lenin really just a German agent? He was. He was sent there by the German High Command to create turmoil and weaken Russia, as we know. Not entirely easy thing to celebrate in any respect. And then perhaps the most difficult of all, 1947, the division of South Asia, India, Pakistan, where I think it is virtually impossible to come even close to a more relaxed discussion on what actually happened. So these both at the same time. You can't understand Europe without understanding the Reformation. You can't understand modern Europe without the Russian Revolution. And you can't understand South Asia without 1947. But they're all very dangerous things to deal with still. So politicians should be left dealing with the future and leave history to the historians. But they should be aware of it and take an interest in it and understand how powerful and how dangerous a force that history is.
I think that Carl is eminently right that this is a very like-minded discussion, but it doesn't necessarily make it boring, I hope anyway. And I'm not surprised given the fact that Carl and Margaret are on the International Board of Historians Without Borders, and Timothy is a central contributor to our anthology and so on. But I would start with the list of anniversaries you mentioned. You've forgotten the last year's anniversary, 250 years from the first legislation on freedom of speech initiated by Anders Tudenius in Sweden, and he was from Finland. But even that is problematic, I think. The limits to freedom of speech in history writing and other instances. It is problematic, but it's not so difficult, because when we are talking about history, we are talking about how history is being used and misused for current purposes. But that doesn't need to have legislation. But when we are talking about hate speech, for example, that is clearly directed against people living perhaps next door to you and are your neighbors. And that is certainly something that we have to deal with rather strictly. 1917, actually, I don't think it's so difficult between Finland and Russia. We had a very good discussion at the conference last year in May with Sergei Zuraliev and a Finnish historian leading on the 1917 historiography in Finland and Russia. And I don't think we have any significant difficulties, at least between historians. It may be that politicians may invent them yet in either country, but that is to be seen. 1918 is the most difficult period in Finnish history, but I think that finally we have also managed to deal with that in a spirit of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. I use this term because Finnish is I think the only other language where you can translate this with a single word, menneisyyden hallinta. But it took a long time also in Finland to come to terms with what happened in 1918 and to be able to do so in a constructive manner. And here is a good example of what politicians and governments can do positively, because we initiated back in some 15 years ago a project on war deaths in Finland 1914 to 1922, which covered all loss of life in war conditions, not only the Civil War, but also in the First World War, where there were Finns involved, the Jäger Battalion and volunteers in the Russian Imperial Army, and the wars of intervention after 1918. And I think that that exercise was very important in creating also common understanding and a recognition that this is something you need to deal with, but you can, once you have dealt with it, you can put it behind you. But that is a very important point, because unless you deal openly with the most difficult periods in your own history, they will inevitably at some point return to haunt you as zombies. So I have perhaps two issues I want to mention, ask you about. First is, nobody mentioned the role of politicians in shaping the factual basis of history. So I think it's very important to underline that we need open access to all historical archives, documents and materials, because denying this is also a way of manipulating history in a negative way. And the second question is, how do we deal with historical monuments? When there is a regime change, it almost everywhere has led to also an erasing of historical monuments which were erected for the former regime of dictators and so on. It is understandable that, and sometimes necessary, that this is done. But I think a cultured approach to history would mean that you respect and retain also those monuments, buildings, etc., which are part of the more unpalatable parts of your history, because with time you can learn to live with them, and they are important focal points for historical understanding. Sometimes people have their difficulty understanding why is there a statue of Tsar Alexander II at the central square of Helsinki between the government building and the university. And I think the answer is in Finnish history, but also that luckily we did not, there were some hotheads obviously, but we did not allow these historical monuments to be erased after our independence.
Thanks, Erkki. Would you like to react very quickly? Otherwise, I would like to turn to the audience a little bit. Tim, would you?
I think we should hear from the audience, but just to say on the access to archives, I remember in 1979 at a conference, the Soviet historian Vyacheslav Dashechev's, when I challenged him about the secret protocol to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, he said, "This document I have not seen in our archives," which is a very nice way of saying. But actually, subsequently, there is now a commission, a Polish-Russian commission, to investigate the difficult issues of their past, headed by a man called Adam Daniel Rotfeld, who has my favorite title. He has this on his visiting card. He's called Plenipotentiary for Difficult Issues. I think everyone should have them. But the publication, which is, I have to say, about that size, because he presented it to me just as I was going on a flight with hand luggage only, but is Polish and Russian historians going through all the archives, and the Russian historians in particular, in absolutely scrupulous detail, documenting exactly how many people were murdered in Katyn. And that's of enormous value.
Maybe you learned something about conflict at Cypri. We did. There is a question right here. Or keep them short and to the point, or your comment, but
yes,
we can listen to a few.
Well, as a German ambassador here in Sweden, I cannot take the role of Cem Özdemir, and I'm very sorry he couldn't come, because I cannot say anything if it's useful of a parliament having an Armenian genocide resolution or no. But as a historian and a diplomat, I found it very interesting discussion, and it's really difficult. As former consul general in New York, I had the normal American against coercive role of the state, but all the Jewish people I met in New York very much in favor of the European directive on xenophobia and anti-Semitism, or anti-racism, what it was. Timothy Garton Ash made a very strong case against the coercive role, but as the panel were all agreed, I would like to take a counterpoint. I think it's good as a rule, but I think there have to be exceptions. Of course, again, difficult to have defined the exceptions. In German law, it clearly limits itself to nationalsozialistische Gewalt- und Willkürherrschaft against crimes under national socialism. So it's a purely thing directed towards German history, and it follows up on German history. And I think this should be the right of a country. It becomes more problematic when you speak about genocide in general and start condemning foreign people on something which happened even other countries like, let's say, Turkey. So I would say if every country deals a bit with its own history, this might be necessary or useful. So I would accept it. One other point is you say that curricula, that is good, it's expressive. But everywhere where I see the state playing a role in curricula, like in Russia and others, it's rather detrimental. And does it not, in the end, boil down again to democracy, freedom of speech, and yes, our values, as we say. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question up here.
Hello, sir. I'm madam. I'm a counselor of Turkish Embassy. I wanted to react to Mr. Ash's few comments, if you allow, rapidly, quickly. Yes, the Armenian question is a huge suffering. That is the stance of our government as well, and our former president and current president and former prime minister also declared this openly. But it is also important to see the suffering of every people. It's pity that you did not mention the Balkanic War, 12 to 14, as if nothing happened. So this is not only Armenians. Many people lost their lives in the First World War, and I'm sorry. And I'll say it openly, but to use the genocide word, the first thing is to have an international court decision. Unfortunately, for the time being, there is not such a decision. So this is the big thing. You talk about the European Human Rights Court decision, but you maybe forgot to read that sentence, that in order to have a genocide, you need an international court, like Nuremberg or like Srebrenica, etc. And last, I will finish, I'm sorry to take long. Mr. Perinček was indeed a patriot. He's not a nationalist, he's a left-wing guy. His party name is Workers' Party, but he's a Kemalist. So I understand what you said. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much. Next question here.
Thank you very much for very interesting remarks. I enjoyed it very much, but there is something missing. I think we all could agree on what you mostly said, But now we're living in different times, and I would like to hear you comment a little bit about these lunatics who are talking about alternative facts. And you know what? We have them in North America, we have them in Europe, we have them in various places. And it's certainly extremely relevant. And how do we defend ourselves against these people who are also dealing with history in different ways?
Thank you. Okay, there's one here. No, it's up here.
Thank you. I missed one philosophical dimension to this discussion, and that is time. It's quite a different way of writing and considering what happened 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, or 10 years ago. I just to give you this for center, I happen to be participating in a seminar in London School of Economics in the early 50s. And there Lord Johnson, who was one of the cabinet ministers in the Attlee government, was asked, what is the invisible hand? Referring, of course, to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. And he thought for a while, and then he said, that's we. Now, that was 170 years later, a social democratic government, rather radical at that time, who bought a concept that meant something totally different in 1776 or 100 years later.
Thank you very much. Please pass the mic back behind you.
My name is Ingrid Törnqvist. I work as a journalist for Swedish television. And I was listening to the former German president, Joachim Gauck, the other day. He was talking about the inability of the political leaders to explain the European project. And I was wondering if you think that Trump could be a positive trigger for Europe and for the millennials.
Okay, that's a great question to pass on to the panel. So since time is also a limiting factor, this will also be your chance to make your final remarks. Who would like to go? Margaret, you look like...
All right, okay. Yeah.
Carl?
Well, I was hoping that this was going to be one of the occasions where we don't have to discuss Trump. It's like, I mean, Sweden is obsessed by it, but we are not alone. It's like going to London. I have said that I refuse to go to London if I have to have Brexit every single conversation. But, okay, we are where we are with Trump. I think two persons are going to make significant contributions to the development of the European Union in a positive way. The one is Vladimir Putin and the other is Donald Trump. I think, and that was, so I'm coming now from a couple of days in Munich with everyone in sight there, and that was really there in the debates. Sort of, we have, call it pressure from the East, or threat from the East, or what you want. We have uncertainty in the West. And the only way of dealing with this is perhaps to get our own act together. Regrettably, without the Brits, but that's the way things are. So I think it's going to have that. You feel that in the air. You can't point at any particular statement, but it's there in the air. So we didn't manage to avoid Trump. I hope he's not going to be a major historical figure. I mean,
figure of comedy, perhaps. These are all interesting points, and of course we couldn't cover everything. We covered a few things, and I think what both Carl Bildt and Timothy Garton Ash have shown is just what a very tricky and important subject this is. And I was very grateful to Timothy for starting out by laying down the sort of distinction between what politicians shouldn't do, what they might do, or perhaps they should do, and what politicians and historians should be doing together. And I think these are very important questions. I think I would err on the side of not interfering too much with curriculum. I think it's dangerous, and when governments do interfere with curriculum, they often do it in a very heavy-handed way. There was a Texas textbook which came out a couple of years ago, approved by a state commission, and it was a state commission dominated by a dentist who was a great patriot and who said proudly, "I know nothing of history." And the textbook they approved said things like, it was really a good thing that all those happy Africans were brought across the Atlantic in ships to work in the United States and make their way there. And there was actually a public fuss about this. But I think states, have a certain role in saying what it is that they think their young should learn. But I think we have to be very, very careful about it. And I think, I'm not going to put words in Timothy's mouth or Carl's mouth, but I think I would err on the side of very, very light touch indeed. I don't know if we're living in such different times. One questioner said we're different. Yes, every time is different, and time moves on, and sometimes the problems have different names, but they're often the same. We change our nomenclature. Or some people talk about alternative facts. When I grew up, we called them lies. And I think I'd rather do it that way. I will stay away from the subject of Donald Trump. I might end with a joke, if I may, on the question of the invisible hand. I don't know if you have them in Sweden, but we had a great many jokes about how many people does it take to change a light bulb. Well, the joke about economists is how many economists does it take to change a light bulb? They never change it. They wait for the invisible hand to do it. I'm sorry, that's not answering your questions, but I thought we needed a joke at this point instead of Trump. So, Timothy.
Well, we certainly do need some economic perspectives too. Timothy.
So, to the German ambassador, I would say I'm the last person on earth who would want to prescribe to Germany how it should think and speak about the Holocaust. That's obviously up to Germany. So, absolutely, I understand that. But you enunciated a principle which is that every country should deal with its own difficult past. What is happening with the framework decision is precisely that there is an attempt to generalize this, and that I think is very problematic. Even if it's one country in its own frontiers, there's always the problem that then Putin or Erdogan or whoever it may be says, oh, well, they do it, you see, so why shouldn't we? Even a model democracy like Germany does it, so why shouldn't we? So there is something of an alibi function, but if we stuck with everyone deals with their own difficult past, we wouldn't be doing too badly. And the Brits have quite a bit to do there too. Trump is relevant to this because of the transformation of the world of information and communications by the internet, and therefore the echo chamber effect, which means that it is more difficult to counter these lies. Donald Trump said Barack Obama was not born in the United States. Yeah. Whereupon Barack Obama produced his birth certificate, which you might think to most of us would rather end of story. Whereupon Donald Trump said, many people feel that this wasn't a proper certificate. It's not even many people think, many people feel. Yeah. Yeah. I think this jacket is dark grey, but you feel it's pink, And it's a sort of emotional narrative constantly repeated in the right-wing echo chamber or the left-wing echo chamber, and it's a real challenge both for journalists and for historians. It's not how do you establish the truth. We know the truth about where Barack Obama is born. It's how do you get it to the people who are in that echo chamber and really don't want to hear, particularly from you, mass media, liberal elite. So I think that is a real challenge. Finally, just on Margaret's, I think, very important point about politicians, and indeed Karl, having a knowledge of history, and Putin saying, as my predecessor Peter the Great said. It's difficult to beat that one, but I think I can, because I once interviewed Helmut Kohl for my history of Ostpolitik, and this absolutely mountainous man, I cannot convey to you how enormous Helmut Kohl was, sitting opposite little me in a little tow chair. And at a certain point in this conversation, Helmut Kohl said, Herr Professor, you do realize you're sitting opposite the direct successor to Adolf Hitler. Now, I think that is a world-beating conversation stopper. I mean, what does one say? I mean, my dear fellow, don't take it so hard. I was literally speechless. But actually, this was a remark of a politician who did have a profound sense and understanding of history. And what he was saying was, I'm aware of my historic responsibility as the first Chancellor of United Germany since Adolf Hitler. Actually, there was someone in between, but I didn't feel like pointing that out, the great Admiral Dönitz, but never mind. And therefore, I'm going to do everything differently and embed Germany in its European context and so on, which he then did. So I think if we're holding up all these examples of bad politicians, I think Helmut Kohl deserves a shout-out.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for reminding us of where we stand in the course of history. It's been a great panel, a great discussion. We are definitely at the Institute here going to continue our work with Historians Without Borders and reflecting on how the historical narrative can impact international development. Erkki, thanks a lot. Your last word.
Well, a word of thanks to the Institute for hosting this seminar, and I'm looking forward to our cooperation. And thanks to our panelists who have provided us with important food for thought and action to counter the misuse of history in politics or anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Tack, jättefint.